Hello, everybody. Welcome to World Review, our weekly look at the news from around the world. Ivo Delder is away this week. I'm Carla Robbins, co-host of the Council on Foreign Relations' The World Next Week podcast, and I'm a former reporter for the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. Today, we're going to be looking at the prospects for Israel-Saudi diplomatic deal, and does it mean that Bibi Netanyahu and the Crown Prince are suddenly off the hook for all their sins? Violence and upcoming elections in Pakistan, and former President Trump's indictment. Oh, yes, yet another one. And how is the rest of the world looking at it? Are they as obsessed as we are? Do they think this is a sign that democracy is working, or something more ominous about the United States? And here with us to discuss all of these issues are a great group of reporters from Princeton, Deb Amos, a professor of journalism at Princeton, as well as a legendary reporter for National Public Radio. Deb, welcome.
Thank you.
From London, Gideon Rachman, Chief Foreign Affairs Commentator for the Financial Times. Gideon, welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And from Washington, D.C., Nirmal Ghosh, U.S. Bureau Chief for the Singapore Straits Times. Nirmal, great to see you again.
Thank you. Good to see you.
So, Deb, can we start with you? Just a few weeks ago, President Biden was freezing out Israel's Bibi Netanyahu for threatening Israel's democracy by pressing his so-called judicial reforms. And before that, before he started worrying about the price of oil, he was denouncing Saudi Arabia's crown prince as a thug. Now the administration is focused on brokering a diplomatic deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia. How serious are the prospects for this deal? How high a price is the U.S. willing to pay for it? And is it worth that price?
Boy, are those the questions. And we haven't seen anything this high profile since the Camp David Accords. So there's lots at stake. The conversation begins with the Saudis. They have back channels with Washington. They have back channels with Tel Aviv because Saudi Arabia and Israel do have a relationship. It's just all in the shadows. But the asks are huge. What the Saudis want for normalization is NATO-like guarantees because they're worried about Iran. And they also want the administration to support them to kickstart this civilian nuclear program. It's not altogether clear what they're asking for with the Israelis: a freeze on settlements, more guarantees for a two-state solution. But if this deal works, it's a windfall for the Israelis. It would be the biggest breakthrough in 40 years. It would solidify the legacy of Benjamin Netanyahu. He would be on par with Menachem Begin after the Camp David Accords. But so much is not clear yet. It would have to get through the U.S. Congress. It could blow up Netanyahu's coalition. There's ultranationalists in his cabinet who would never agree to a freeze on settlements. So is he willing to blow up the government that he sits in now? High stakes, high win, but so much could go wrong.
Mm.
So, Gideon, is this worth it? I mean, the Israelis already have all sorts of relations with the Saudis, not so under the table. They're not about to go to war with each other. It seems like it's taking a lot of pressure off of Bibi, and the Saudis.
I think it's. I look. If I was the Israelis, I could see why I would want it. I just really don't understand why the US would do this at this particular stage. I mean, given that if you look at what's happening in Israel, the country's sort of ripping itself apart over what the liberal opposition, which is about 50% of the country, say is an effort to destroy Israeli democracy. So why would you give Netanyahu this enormous prize now? It seems to me a crazy thing to do. And now I'm sure, as you say, that as Deborah was saying, there would be tensions within the Netanyahu coalition. But frankly, even if the Israelis promised to free settlements or proceed with a two-state solution, why would you believe them? I mean, they could promise to do that, but once relations were normalized, given all the pressures in the country, I don't think they'd do that. Certainly not this bunch. And why would the US give Saudi Arabia a security guarantee when America is trying to pivot away from the Middle East and believes that, one of the big mistakes of their last 30 years of foreign policy has been over-involvement with this particular region? So to me, none of it makes sense, but I'm told by friends in Washington that it would be a big win ahead of the election. It would be something that Biden could present and so on. But I don't think it's a great idea. I mean, I'm not opposed to peace. Obviously, in a sense, one understands the Abraham Accords, even if they're pretty dodgy governments involved. It's great. People can trade and travel and so on. So I suppose if Saudi Arabia and Israel were able to build a relationship, but they're both. I mean, there were reasons why Biden was rough on both Netanyahu and MBS, and they haven't gone away. So I think America would gain a lot less from it than Israel and Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, one of the things also that the Saudis are asking for is not just a civilian nuclear program. They're asking for enrichment capabilities. I mean, nobody needs enrichment capabilities. And the only reason you could possibly want it at this point is because with a little bit more work, not only do you get nuclear fuel, you have the potential for getting a nuclear weapon. Yeah. And I mean, they're giving away, that's a lot to give away for something that
Although I was always told, but maybe Nirmal knows about this, that the Pakistani nuclear bomb is sort of the Saudi nuclear bomb in waiting, and that they have some kind of understanding, but sure, absolutely. And how does that square with all the non-proliferation efforts vis-a-vis Iran?
So if you talk to Arab analysts in Washington, they will make this argument, which I just put out there. I'm not sure if I believe it, but I'll tell you what it is, which is if you empower these regional countries, you can move America, you can draw down from the bases out there. You can eventually get to the thing that you want the most, which is to get out of the Middle East in the profile we are today. That the Saudis, and you can see this they were the ones that started this discussion. They're having a peace conference about Ukraine this weekend, that they clearly are ramping up their role. So if it gets you out of the Middle East, does that make it worth it? I mean, I suppose philosophically, yes, maybe, but this is such a hard sell to all the parties that it's hard to imagine that you can get there.
So Nirmal, Deb raised this peace conference, this Ukrainian peace plan conference. It's something Zelensky wanted. The Saudis are hosting it. It's a really interesting invite list. It's pretty much everybody who's been sitting on the fence for Ukraine up until now and the global South. And the Chinese have been invited, although it's not clear whether they're going to come either virtually or in person. What do we know about the status of that conference, and what are you going to be watching for?
The war has become more dangerous in a sense because of the drone attacks in Russia, right? So everybody's really more seized of the need to find a resolution because the danger is Putin's nuclear saber rattling. I mean the sort of doctrine, so to speak, is that if the Russian state is threatened, we'll use nuclear weapons. Well, if Ukraine attacks inside Russia with drones in Moscow, that it could be construed as threatening the Russian state. So I think it's suddenly become even more acute than it was, if that is possible, that there has to be a negotiated solution to this war. And that's what everybody's looking for. I think it's going to be a very difficult ask at this stage still.
So do you think the Chinese are in any way changing their position on Ukraine?
Well, in a sense, yes, that they don't want to be dragged. They don't want to be in a position where they get involved, whether it's through delivery of supply of XYZ, whether it's anything at all. They don't want to be painted as involved, and they've already been sort of painted as in a sort of friendship with Russia and all that, and that. It's entirely pragmatic. The Chinese feel themselves ringed in by U.S. allies in the East, and they have to have a stable Russia. Russia imploding is not in Chinese interests at all. So they're entirely pragmatic, and they would definitely want as much as anybody else want an end to this.
So Gideon, what are you going to be watching for in this conference? And I think it's in Jeddah this weekend.
Well, I mean. Whether there's any air of reality to it, I mean, I can understand. It seems to me a slightly odd peace conference if one party to the conflict isn't there, Russia. So I'm not quite sure what they're going to do? I mean, is it a Ukrainian effort to persuade the world, finally more of the world, to try and come behind their view of the conflict, which incidentally is that there is no peace deal to be had? You know, the Ukrainians are not pushing for a peace deal. Or is it the rest of the world trying to push Ukraine into making some kind of deal with Russia? And is there a deal to be had? Because, you know, we ran, I'm afraid, I thought, a rather persuasive piece this week by Alexander Gabuev of the Carnegie Endowment, saying if you look at what Putin is actually doing, he's ramping up for a larger war. You know, he's recruiting more people, he's building up the military-industrial complex. So even if the Ukrainians were to put their hands up and say, which I don't expect them to, yeah, okay, we'll try and negotiate with the Russians. Will the Russians play ball? So, I mean, look, it's interesting. I mean, it's partly interesting because of what it says about the Saudis as well, who were this very introverted power, but under MBS are now doing everything from buying up the world's footballers to developing massive cities, holding big conferences, trying to become international players. And that is a very interesting development, but I don't think they're going to bring peace to Ukraine.
Can I ask a question about this? You know, the Ukrainians have been insistent that there has to be an international war crimes tribunal. And what they want is a vote in the UN General Assembly. The Americans are against it. They do not support it. The Brits kind of do. The French don't. And so it occurred to me at some moment, is this their moment, the Ukrainians, to be able to lobby? Because at this moment, you could not get a vote passed in the UN General Assembly because of the Global South. You know, their position has been, it's not fair, this international tribunal for Russia when we didn't have one for Iraq. So they know that they don't have that vote now, and they must lobby to get it because they don't have support from the US. And I wondered if this is their moment to talk to the Global South in Jeddah.
I thought, look, maybe I'm missing the point, but I thought that they did have support from the US. I distinctly remember sitting in the Munich Security Conference and Kamala Harris gave a whole speech saying there should be accountability for war crimes. It may not be around a tribunal, but anyway.
It is not around a tribunal. That is correct, because there's only one place that you could do the crime of aggression, and that is in an international war crimes tribunal that would be backed by the United Nations. You can't do it at the ICC. You can't do it in the national courts. And this is the point that Ukraine has been banging away on. We must have the crime of aggression, and that will take some lobbying.
But the U.S. the Biden administration has done something, even though we are not part of the ICC, and the George W. Bush administration actually unsigned the commitment to the ICC. They're actually providing support to the ICC for their cases against Russia there. And you're right, they're different crimes. In my impression of what the Ukrainians want out of this meeting is they want people to commit to their 10 points, and more than anything else, they're committing to territorial integrity, which is, as Gideon said, not a peace deal. It's not a compromise. Although this might be quite an interesting moment because they have a very good argument to make, and specifically to the fence sitters, which is the Russians are not doing good things for grain prices right now with the Black Sea grain deal. There's lots of things that are going on that are actually affecting not just us, but you. They couldn't get, this is actually the second meeting. They had a meeting in Copenhagen. They couldn't get a joint statement. If they get a joint statement out of it, maybe there is more support in the General Assembly for other things that they want. There were a lot of fence sitters in the last, I think 31, 32 in the last, anything that ups the pressure, although who knows what goes on in Putin's head. We move on. Nirmal, last week a suicide bomber blew himself up at a political rally in northwest Pakistan, killing more than 50 people and wounding 200. And it was responsibility claimed by ISK, who were main actors in Afghanistan. Should we see it solely as a spillover from an increasingly chaotic Afghanistan, or is this also a warning about instability in Pakistan and, that this could affect the national election this fall?
Yeah, well, it's all of the above, really. It is certainly a spillover. So if you look at it in context, Pakistan is in a very difficult place right now. Its GDP growth has been something like 0.5%. Remember, it had that massive epic flood disaster last year. Annual inflation is running at, I think, 28% plus, which is phenomenal. It's just been given a $3 billion bailout by the IMF, but that, of course, comes with caveats. And one of them is a hike in petrol and diesel prices, which is driving inflation further higher. The return of the Taliban in Afghanistan emboldened the Pakistani Taliban, the Tehrik-e-Taliban-e-Pakistan, TTP, which has been staging multiple attacks on the army and government. And we have its competitor, the ISK, as you mentioned, the Islamic State Khorasan, which claimed that huge suicide bomb at Bajaur near the Afghanistan border, right? Horrific attack. The attack was on a political rally by an Islamist party, the JUIF, which has a very strong presence across the Pashtun belt, on the border, and is aligned with the Taliban. The ISK perceives the JUIF as a political wing of the Pakistani Taliban and has basically declared open season and has been attacking JUIF people regularly. Now, Pakistan is heading into an election as well. It was supposed to. Under the constitution, 3 months before an election, the government is turned into a caretaker government. The assembly is dissolved, and that is supposed to be happening sometime this month. And then 19 days to an election. So we are looking at around November. So, of course, in the political landscape, there are these two huge major political parties run by families. The PML, Pakistan Muslim League, run by the Sharif family. The current PM is Shahbaz Sharif, brother of former PM Nawaz, who was once overthrown by the military, later disqualified. Long story there. Then we have the Pakistan People's Party, which is the Bhutto family. And then we had the advent more recently of the PTI, which is Imran Khan's. And Khan was once a darling of the military, but then fell out and was ousted in a parliamentary vote. And then his supporters rioted. He wanted to show his strength. They attacked military headquarters of all things. So nobody thinks Imran will be allowed to win an election and become PM again. The army has the power to delay the election, do what it wants, really. We are looking at an extremely volatile few months ahead. At the end of the day, the reality is that the political parties are corrupt. Corruption is endemic. It is a military which is the only source of state stability in Pakistan. Another element to this is India. Now, Pakistan's PM Sharif just said he is open to talks with India, and the US State Department said, yes, that's a good idea. Frankly, nobody expects any talks because there's really no incentive on either side. Any Pakistani politician entering into talks with India risks being hammered for appeasement in the campaign and will also raise the suspicion of the army. And on the Indian side, India doesn't have any reason to talk. It's being wooed by the United States. Modi is heading into an election next year as well. You could argue that because of this, he can, in fact, talk to Pakistan, but he really has nothing to gain from doing so. So that also is going nowhere. So Pakistan is in a very, very dire and volatile situation.
So Gideon, Nirmal laid it out, Pakistan's in a dire situation. The U.S. has been passionately courting Modi. But it seems like it's lost all interest in Pakistan once we get out of Afghanistan. It used to be, we didn't have a Pakistan policy. We had an AFPAC policy. We had an Afghanistan-Pakistan policy. But the place is as dangerous as ever. In fact, when we had our debates about whether Afghanistan mattered, it always came down to Afghanistan mattered because it was next to Pakistan, and Pakistan had 170 nuclear weapons. It still has 170 nuclear weapons. Sure. Does the U.S. need a Pakistan policy now?
Yeah, I would have thought so. But I mean, I'm not sure what that policy would be. But the combination of factors that Nirmal lays out are pretty compelling. I mean, I think one challenge for America will be to avoid their courtship of Modi dragging them into an entirely kind of Indian view of Pakistan. Because that clearly is a goal of Modi's and would be a kind of big win for him. But I don't think, that would be productive, particularly given, I mean, you say that they used to see Pakistan entirely through the prism of China. I think the danger is now they'll see it partly through the prism of courting India and therefore through the prism of China, because, of course, Pakistan is now quite close to being a client state of China. And one wonders whether you're going to get a kind of flip of the Cold War situation where America used to be close to Pakistan, and that's the source of a lot of the remaining Indian reservations about the United States was that Cold War relationship, to one where actually the two sides are, it's now China, Pakistan, and India, the US as the adversaries, and that wouldn't be great either. I should add, just as a footnote, that I was told by somebody at the British Foreign Office that our largest single embassy is in Pakistan, because we have a huge population of Pakistani origin, in enormously complex relationships to do with that, to do with drugs, to do with Islamic fundamentalism, etc., etc. So for us in the UK, we certainly can't afford to forget about Pakistan, although I'm not sure we have any solutions either.
Is there a Pakistan policy, or is this just more monitoring what's going on?
I think, we got a microcosm of that. I mean, in the sense that what I described with the US, that Britain is also courting India very, very hard, because our big prize that we're after is a free trade agreement with India, and India is obviously a much more significant economy than Pakistan. But for domestic reasons, we need relationships with both India and Pakistan, and one of the kind of slight anxieties is that Indian-Pakistani tensions could actually spill over into the UK. There were riots in Leicester not so long ago, where there was it was denied by the Indians, but to be a sort of BJP element amongst the Hindu community and an Islamic fundamentalist element amongst the sort of Muslim community. So we're quite keen to kind of keep the tensions of South Asia there and not in the UK.
So, Deb, you spent a lot of time thinking about terrorism in the Middle East. When you talk to people in the government about the Middle East, do they ever talk about terrorism in Afghanistan? Are they spending any time worrying about ISK, spending any time worrying about what's going on in Pakistan? It used to be the sole obsession of the U.S. government.
That is correct. But to be very honest with you, Carla, I don't ask those questions anymore. I really have shifted my focus. I'm really looking at war crimes tribunals and how the law works, and it comes from 2 years of following the Syrian war crimes trials in Germany. So I am off the terrorism beat, thank God.
So, Nirmal, I'm going to go back to you. Why would ISK be exploding bombs in Pakistan? I mean, I understand it's a border area, but are they making a bid in Pakistan?
Yeah. They want the return of the Taliban in Afghanistan was a huge boost for all the Islamist groups, right? But of course, they compete with each other. ISK competes with the Taliban, and it's also very amorphous because there are so many groups in that area. In Pakistan and in Afpak, we don't like the term, but for the sake of convenience, and they're somewhat amorphous, and people change sides and switch around and all that. And I remember Hillary Clinton once said that if you keep a snake, you can't keep a snake in your backyard and expect it to bite only the neighbors. So unfortunately, Pakistan, the army, yes. Pakistan has suffered more than anybody else from terrorism. That's what they say. And it is actually true. If you look at the number of terrorist attacks and stuff. But then for various reasons, to keep India off balance and whatnot, they've also tolerated the presence. Of course, Osama bin Laden, was in Pakistan when the US finally got him. They've also, I'm not saying that Pakistan is new it, but, he was there. So Pakistan has, for a long time, tolerated the presence of some of these groups, so long as they don't destabilize Pakistan. So I think that honestly, it redounds again to the army to keep it together, because again, the army is the only institution which is capable of keeping a lid on this and on all this, and maintaining the integrity of the Pakistani state, because Pakistan Taliban wants to convert it into Islamic State. ISK wants to do the same thing. So Pakistan as we speak, is an ongoing battleground between all these various factions.
Gideon, do people spend any time in the British government thinking about Afghanistan and whether it's going to hold together and the fallout of this? It's so remarkable that we could walk away from it, and after debating for such a long time about if it were to unravel, and could the terrorism be kept inside the borders of Afghanistan or the borders of the AfPak region, or has Britain walked away from Afghanistan the way we walked?
We walked away from Europe, so yeah, so we'll probably walked away from Afghanistan as well. But I mean, I think there is still some vestigial debate. There's there's quite a, as in the US, quite a community of ex-military people, ex-foreign office people who feel, a lingering guilt or commitment to the place and have an interest in Afghanistan. They had people who worked with them there, or so on. So I think that there's still some news coverage. There was a little controversy recently where a Conservative MP, ex-army guy, went there and came back and said, look, we're going to have to deal with the Taliban more, and that not everything about them is negative. And he got shouted down and told that he was a bad guy. But it was an example, I think, that there is a continuing debate, as I say, partly led by this community of people, many of whom spent, many years there. And I think that there's a sense that, yes, it matters. It's not number one priority. But if you look at, for example, refugees, which is a big issue right across Europe and in the UK, a lot come from Afghanistan. We have a reasonably large community now of people of Afghan origin. So it's not disappeared off the map, but clearly it's not the issue it once was.
Well, the gap in the United States between you can completely rewrite, like a national defense strategy or a national security strategy, in which terrorism was the focus forever. And then one day it's, great power conflict. But then you have an entire military which defined itself for 20 years about fighting terrorism and focusing on Iraq and Afghanistan, and also has the experience of getting out of Iraq and then having to get back into Iraq because of ISIS. And there are people in Washington who do keep, not just because of nostalgic reasons, keep an eye. And when something like Pakistan happens, they start saying to themselves, and certainly I'm hearing it, saying to themselves, I'm not sure we can really completely walk away from this. And it's not just...
Although I don't know, do people say, as I've heard said here and occasionally in Washington, that yes, the exit from Afghanistan was a disaster and an embarrassment, but that, with the passage of time, maybe it was the right thing to do if badly handled, that Biden made the right call?
Well, I think people are relieved, but I think there is this whole debate when something like this happens, and which ISK is not as weak as people had hoped. And there is a big debate about over the horizon counterterrorism, which has been what Biden always wanted to do.
And indeed, women's rights. We get these continuing horrific stories out of Afghanistan of that. And I think people rightly have a bad conscience about it.
Yeah. So, Gideon, I'm going to continue on to you. You wrote this week, the future of democracy in America will turn on the trials of Donald Trump and the political turmoil that will surround them. So I certainly feel that way. How is this indictment and the wider Trump spectacle being seen in Europe? And what does it mean for U.S. influence and standing?
Well, I think for the moment it is being seen, as the word you used, as a spectacle. I mean, there's a lot of people who are tired of Trump, but he certainly compels attention, and it feels like a flashback to the way things were 4 years ago when he was dominating the news. What has he said now? What's he done now? And what's this sort of feeling we're back into that? As for the implications, I mean, I had quite an interesting conversation actually at the British Foreign Office a while back, where I was sort of saying, just to slightly provoke them, you should take seriously the possibility that Trump might become president again. Look at the opinion polls. And one of the people there said, we feel that we made a mistake last time and that we discounted it, and then we were caught by surprise. And we really can't afford to make that mistake again. So I think that in the background, people are beginning to think through, what it might mean. But I don't know how far you can get, because Trump is so unpredictable. And the worst case scenarios with Trump are so extreme, pulling out of NATO, for example. I mean, how do you plan for that? So I think that people are beginning to think about it, but there is no alternative United States. So you can't say, well, they're frightfully unreliable. Let's rely on somebody else. Who exactly? So people don't. America's closest allies don't really have a plan B for if America descends into chaos.
But the very fact of this indictment, is this seen as, look at the strength of the system, that they can bring such a powerful person to heel, or at least talk about accountability? Or is it seen as more chaos, how ominous this is, that the United States, this beacon of democracy, came that close to losing it?
I think, both. As in the US itself, that people, we don't really know how it's going to play out. But I think there is this lingering anxiety that, at least, there are people, one shouldn't forget, in Europe and in Asia, who are sympathetic to Trump. There are sort of mini Trumps out there, but assuming that's not mainstream opinion, that yes, it's right that he's brought to account, but there is this anxiety that he has such a huge base of support. So that, I think, is what people find so unsettling. They say, what kind of a country, or what's going on there, that so many people can look at this and say, yeah, I'm going to vote for it.
So, Deb, you spent so many years as a foreign correspondent. Okay, I'm going to do it. Susan Stamberg once referred to you as a news Bedouin. I love that.
Okay.
How do you think this is playing? How do you think this affects the perception of the United States? Look,
we've had two demonstrations of the oddness of democracy, one of them in Tel Aviv and one of them in the United States. And the Tel Aviv one was, I don't know about you, but I was watching pictures day after day after day of these amazing number of people out on the street. The military says, I'm not going along with this. Reservists say, I'm going to quit. And yet they do it. And yet they do it anyway. So, if that had been a straight vote, but there was no way to do that, they would have lost. But they just barreled through. And I think that the Trump phenomenon raises the same kind of questions. What is this? What kind of democracy is this, where you bring a guy to account and then his base numbers go up? And, I think he said yesterday or the day before that, I know this tells you what's happening in America. I just need one more indictment to win the election. And that was a comment on, the more you guys do this, the better it is for me. He raises more money. You begin to see, as I said, I've been focusing on Ukraine. So you begin to see all the Ukraine people saying, wow, okay, we better get this taken care of before there's a change in government in Washington. That's been really interesting. This idea about how do you prepare for withdrawing from NATO is a bigger question. But, there would be smaller steps before we got there. So sure. I think, we are going to become much more inward looking. We talked about this a little bit before the program, that we're back in Trump world. It's going to dominate the news. We're not going to hear about much else. Get your subscriptions to international papers paid up, because that's the only way you're going to find out about the news, because you're not going to see it here. So we're going to be more inward looking. And I think that the rest of the world is going to watch this carefully to try to figure out, does he win next time? And what does that mean?
Yeah, former President Trump did say at a rally in Pennsylvania over the weekend that, quote, Congress should refuse to authorize a single additional shipment of our depleted weapons stockpiles to Ukraine until the FBI, DOJ, and IRS hand over every scrap of evidence they have on the Biden crime family's corrupt business dealings. And then he went on to say that any Republican lawmakers who didn't join the effort should face primary challenges. Of course, this is what he got impeached for, one of these things, trying to link, going after Hunter Biden to aid to Ukraine. But, I have to assume that has resonance in Ukraine and has to have resonance in Europe. But you were saying that people in Ukraine are talking about this already?
Yeah, because it has to do with, where does the support stop? Okay, if the Republicans win the White House in 2024, what does that mean to us? And they can read like we can. They see what he says. and it's on their minds. The offensive is not going well. I think that's partly why the Saudis are successful in having peace talks in Jeddah, because nobody's going to have a slam dunk win. But then, did anybody think that anybody would? So at some moment, both sides get tired. Let's see. But yes, I think that people are in Ukraine, and people who specialize in this in Europe are thinking, all right, do we have a time window, and what do we do with it?
And the time window is between now and
2024.
And 2024. So, Nirmal, how is this? You also wrote about the Trump indictments, and your job is to translate the United States back home, back to the Straits Times. Why did you decide to write about it? And what do you think people's reaction to that there? Is it just Trump fascination? Is it prepare yourself for a Trump reelection? What does it say about the perception of U.S. democracy? So,
a certain degree of Trump fascination, yes. I think a question which arises a lot is if he's got all these charges against him, indictments against him, how come he can still be a candidate? Right? They don't quite understand how the U.S. democratic system works. So I have to explain that. Legally he can still run, even from a jail cell. He can actually run, and there's also difficulty. And this has been there before, of course, in understanding the power of his hold over his base, sort of cult-like hold. Now this is very interesting because Trump's base has a cult-like hold on his base. Modi's base in India is also pretty cult-like, and we are looking at a world where if the Republicans or a Trumper wins in 2024, we're looking at a world where major economies, major powers are all run by authoritarian dictatorship, because China, the whole works, changes the complexion completely. Now, what is very dangerous, I find, in the US is the erosion, or even I would say close to the destruction of faith in institutions. I've had a lot of time with Trump supporters, and I ask them regularly, because it intrigues me, is there were something like 60 lawsuits challenging the election and the election result 2020, and none of them, I think almost none of them, got any traction at all. And they say, well, judiciary's bought. So there's no trust at all in the system. And you can have all the checks and balances you want. As someone said to me the other day, you can have all the checks and balances you want, but if a large, significant chunk of your population just doesn't believe in the system, thinks the entire system is corrupt, then you have a serious problem. And America is not in a good place at all. I think, like what Gideon said, there's no way you can rule out Trump, although the conventional wisdom that his base is fiercely loyal, but it is narrow and it is not wide enough, broad enough to carry a presidential election. But hey, there were people who said all kinds of things about Trump before, and we all know what happened, right? And there are so many unknowns still ahead in the next year or so. And also in the longer term, so you have this phenomenon of two old men fighting for the US presidency. What will happen after that? What will happen? What is the next generation going to look like? Is it going to be even more extreme? That's a question. And the second question, of course, is if a Trump-like person wins and there's America first after 2024, like Gideon said, what happens to NATO? What happens to Ukraine? What happens to Taiwan, for example? So it's very difficult, as Gideon said, to prepare for these scenarios. You just have to live with what comes, around the bend.
There was such a sense of relief. I mean, I think when Biden came in, and then certainly in Europe, and certainly everybody I spoke with, among our allies when Biden came in, and then people sort of freaked out when Afghanistan happened. And then this sense of relief again. Certainly Putin made it easier to rally people, but to keep the alliance itself together. I don't know if it's the sense of the ticking clock. I don't know if it's these indictments reminding it. I'm not picking up as much anxiety, but I'm not in Europe about it. I'm living with my own anxiety here about it. But I hadn't heard that that people were rushing anything forward related to Ukraine. But the aid debate, with the National Defense Authorization Act, was a reminder that it's not as, the support is eroding within the Republican Party. Gideon, can we talk a little bit? We have some time here. Can we talk a little bit about the war and how we should be thinking about that? And Deb mentioned that the counteroffensive is not going well. Where are we on the war?
Well, I don't think we can gloss over that. I mean, there are people saying, be patient, etc. But, I remember back in May, I saw some pretty senior people in the sort of NATO world, and they were quite optimistic about how the counteroffensive would go. So it clearly has disappointed. Now we hear all the stuff about Russian minefields and so on. And it was certainly one of the questions in my mind was, this was the most heavily trailed counteroffensive in history. They had months to prepare for this, the Russians, and maybe we became overconfident in how chaotic they seemed. And after Kharkiv and Kherson, and then of course Prigozhin. I mean, obviously not everything is rosy on the Russian side. That Prigozhin stuff happened after the counteroffensive had begun. It hasn't gone great, and now we have this new development that Nirmal referred to, which is that Ukrainians beginning to hit inside Russia. And I'd be very interested to know what the White House feels about that, because they've been very concerned about escalation. And I think they're still concerned about escalation. And I think that just beneath the surface, there are real tensions between Kiev and Washington. They're definitely on the same side, but the Americans find the Ukrainians quite difficult to deal with, and Ukrainians exasperated by how slow the Americans, as they see it, have been in providing a lot of weaponry that eventually was provided. So that relationship is also a difficult one.
It is interesting when, as Nirmal said about the drones, you haven't seen any public warnings about that, and that usually does come out. Maybe it will, but you haven't heard that. I mean, the complaints that you've been hearing have been much more from the Ukrainians, and I can't really blame them.
No,
you have an offensive, and the F-16s are going to come in September.
Sure, absolutely, and then there is a lopsidedness that Russia's allowed to bomb Kiev every night, to kill civilians at will, and Ukraine is not allowed to hit Russia. That does seem a bit unfair. But I mean, I also think that one of the things we say about bombing offensives is they always appeal to generals, but they don't make domestic populations rethink wars. They actually make them more determined. You've seen that with the Ukrainians, and I fear you might see it with the Russians, that if they start being hit in Moscow, that might actually solidify support for Putin, not the opposite.
Absolutely.
But I have to say that, the war in Ukraine in the American media has sort of disappeared. I was at a wedding in Colorado Springs, and they were asking what I was doing, and they said, "Oh yeah, the war in Ukraine. We don't hear about that much anymore." And I think that's true here. I think in Europe you still have a lot of coverage, but here you don't.
Yeah, and declining coverage here. I mean, obviously, I remember the first month of the war, it led the BBC News first 20 minutes for about a month, yes. And now it might be, item 9, 10.
And Nirmal, in your world, are people talking about Ukraine? I mean, did the Black Sea grain deal at least bring, the food price issue at least draw people's attention, or is it all China all the time and that's it?
It's more about China, and this goes back to actually what we were talking about before we went on air, which Deborah, I think you mentioned that in the US it's going to become increasingly internally focused in the next year and a half. The China thing is not going to go away. China is the sort of existential threat and all that. But Ukraine, nobody in the global South, there is still anxiety, as I said before, about Ukraine because of the ripple impact on the global economy, inflation and so forth, energy prices, food security and all that. It's never a good idea, right, to have a war like this dragging on. But the big concern is really China. and the direction of U.S.-China relations and U.S.-China competition. That's really the major concern. And from our perspective in, say, Southeast Asia, there is. They want the U.S. to remain engaged in Southeast Asia. They want the U.S. to step up the economic game in Southeast Asia. And they do not want to be, you hear this constant refrain from Southeast Asia about not wanting to have to choose between China and the US. And the US says, of course, we're not asking you to choose. But then implicit in the US language is that you should choose. And so they really, the US needs to listen a little bit more, and not just listen, but empathize with middle and smaller powers which are sitting on China's doorstep and have borne the brunt in the Cold War of horrible wars, proxy wars. So the US needs to, there's a huge reservoir. I keep telling people there's a huge reservoir of goodwill for the US in Southeast Asia. Apart from a few pockets in Malaysia, Indonesia, a few pockets, there's a huge reservoir of goodwill. And the US doesn't have to be that anxious about China's extending its hegemony over Southeast Asia, because in Southeast Asia, they're used to dealing with China. Look at Vietnam, they're used to dealing with China. There's no real love lost for China, if I may say so, in, say, Myanmar, in Vietnam, and so forth. But they just have to live with the reality of China. And China is a huge market. China comes and builds infrastructure. Nothing wrong with that. They need that. But they also need the US to be engaged and up its economic game specifically. They find the general perception of the US is too weighted towards military. Yes, it's been deepening its alliances and all that, but it's too weighted towards military. And it needs to, the problem is that Trump pulled out of the TPP. That is the root of much of this. The US is not at the table in any of these free trade agreements. And you will not get any free trade agreements because you can't do it domestically in the US. So you have the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, but that's kind of like a wishy-washy thing. They're still negotiating the various pillars and all that. It's not a free trade agreement. So the US needs to up its game in Asia and Southeast Asia in general. The GSP also is still pending.
So trade, we're definitely going to have to come back and talk about trade, but I'm glad that you gave us at least a little bit something more upbeat to end with. I just want to thank everybody. That's it for this week's edition, World Review from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. I want to thank Gideon Rachman of the FT, Nirmal Ghosh of the Straits Times, and Deb Amos of Princeton, and famously of NPR. Evo will be back next week, and we hope to see you all here then. Stay safe, everyone. Thanks so much.
Thank you.